For centuries, people believed that once a head was severed from the body, consciousness ended instantly. It seemed like a settled question. But as more executions took place, some of the doctors who witnessed them began reporting things that didn't fit that explanation. And the more closely they looked, the more disturbing the mystery became. There was one machine that stood at the center of this debate, called the guillotine. It started in 1789. France was struggling under massive social inequality. The monarchy had a justice system that even the way a person died depended on their social status. Noblemen were usually executed with a sword, which was relatively quick if done properly. Ordinary people faced much harsher deaths. They could be hanged, broken on the wheel, or burned alive. These punishments were often public, painful, and intentionally prolonged. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin was a physician and a member of the newly created French National Assembly. He was not known as a violent man. He was a reformer who believed the law should treat everyone equally. In October 1789, he proposed a simple idea to the assembly that every person sentenced to death, whether rich or poor, noble or commoner, should die in the same way. The execution should be mechanical, fast, and consistent. There should be no risk of an inexperienced executioner or a dull blade turning an execution into a prolonged ordeal. The assembly agreed with the idea. 2 years later, in 1791, Dr. Antoine Louis, secretary of the French College of Surgeons, was asked to design the machine itself. He hired a German craftsman named Tobias Schmidt, who was best known for building harpsichords. Together, they developed the device and tested different blade designs on human corpses. After repeated trials, they chose an angled blade rather than a straight one. They believed it cut more reliably and worked better on people with different neck sizes. On April 25, 1792, the machine was used for the first time. The condemned man was Nicolas Jacques Pelletier, a highway robber convicted of robbery and assault. The execution lasted only a few seconds. Many spectators in Paris were reportedly disappointed. They had expected a dramatic public spectacle, and instead witnessed a death that, by the standards of that time, was remarkably quick and uneventful. Between 1793 and 1794, the guillotine changed from a legal tool into something much larger. This period became known as the Reign of Terror, when the revolutionary government, led by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, tried to eliminate anyone seen as a threat to the revolution. People could be arrested on suspicion alone, brought before revolutionary tribunals, and sentenced to death after trials that sometimes lasted only minutes. Between September 1793 and July 1794, at least 16,500 people were officially executed by guillotine across France. The real number was likely much higher once deaths in prison and unofficial executions are included. In Paris, the machine stood at the Place de la Révolution, the square now known as Place de la Concorde. On the busiest days, dozens of executions took place in a single session. One prisoner was brought forward, the blade fell, the head dropped into a leather basket, the body was removed, and the next prisoner immediately took their place. The man responsible for carrying out many of these executions was Charles-Henri Sanson, the chief executioner in Paris. He'd held the position since 1778 and came from a family that had served as executioners for generations. Sanson was not known for drama or exaggeration. He kept detailed records of his work. Over time, he began noticing something that the designers of the guillotine had never seriously considered. The severed heads did not always appear completely lifeless. Sanson repeated seeing heads that moved after decapitation. Some appeared to shift their eyes, others seemed to move their mouths. He didn't describe these events as supernatural or mysterious. He described them as observations from a man who had witnessed thousands of deaths. He understood what normal post-mortem muscle spasms looked like, and he believed that some of what he saw could not be explained so easily. These reports did not appear in formal scientific journals. Instead, they spread through letters, conversations, and accounts from other officials and witnesses who claimed to have seen similar things. Despite the stories, no serious investigation followed. The guillotine had become too important to the revolutionary government. During the Terror, officials were far more concerned with carrying out executions then questioning what happened in the seconds afterward. Ironically, Robespierre himself eventually met the same fate. On July 28, 1794, he was guillotined, bringing the reign of terror to an end. The machine survived him, and so did the unanswered question. In 1795, a respected German scientist named Samuel Thomas von Semmering entered the debate. Von Semmering was one of Europe's leading anatomists. Born in 1755, he had spent much of his career studying the human nervous system and the structure of the brain. Unlike many people of his time, he viewed the brain as a physical organ governed by biological processes. He knew that brain cells depended on a constant supply of oxygen carried through the blood. In an open letter published in a French medical journal, von Semmering argued that decapitation might not cause immediate unconsciousness. His argument was based on anatomy rather than speculation. When the head is separated from the body, blood flow stops instantly. However, blood already inside the brain and surrounding tissue doesn't disappear at that moment. For a short period, that remaining blood still contains oxygen. Von Semmering believed that during those brief seconds, the brain could continue functioning and might remain aware of what had happened. Many French doctors rejected his argument. By that point, the guillotine had become closely linked to the ideals of the French Revolution. Questioning whether it was truly humane was politically sensitive. The main counter-argument was that the sudden and catastrophic drop in blood pressure would cause immediate unconsciousness, regardless of how much oxygen remained inside the brain. It was a reasonable explanation, but nobody had actually proved it. The debate intensified in 1796 when a French physician named Jean-Joseph Sue published his own report. He gathered accounts from doctors, officials, and witnesses who had attended multiple executions. Several described severed heads reacting to sounds, showing facial expressions, or appearing to direct their attention toward people around them. Sue argued that these reactions were too consistent and too specific to be dismissed as simple reflexes. His critics pointed out a major problem. Reflexes and conscious responses can look very similar to someone watching from the outside. A twitch, a movement in the eyes, or a change in facial expression does not automatically prove awareness. Without a controlled, scientific experiment, there was no way to know what was really happening. And in 1796, science simply did not have the tools needed to study a living human brain in the seconds after decapitation. The debate faded for a time. Though something happened on July 17, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution, Paris. The condemned was a 24-year-old woman named Charlotte Corday. 4 days earlier, she had traveled from the city of Caen to Paris with a specific goal. She gained access to the apartment of Jean-Paul Marat, one of the most influential radical figures of the French Revolution, and stabbed him while he sat in a medicinal bath treating a painful skin condition. She made no attempt to flee. She was arrested immediately, put on trial by the Revolutionary Tribunal, and sentenced to death. Her execution attracted a large crowd. Corday walked to the scaffold without help, refused to wear a blindfold, and faced the guillotine directly. The blade fell, and the execution was over in seconds. Then, one of the executioner's assistants, a man named François Legros, picked up Corday's severed head and slapped it across the face. The act was meant to humiliate her, even after death. According to numerous witnesses, both of her cheeks suddenly turned red. Even more striking, several people claimed her facial expression changed into what they described as clear anger or indignation. News of the incident spread through Paris almost immediately. Doctors, officials, and educated observers discussed it in letters and private correspondence. Some argued there was nothing mysterious about it. They believed the redness could be explained by blood collecting in the small blood vessels of the face after death, a process that would not require any consciousness at all. Others were less convinced. They argued that a simple rush of blood could explain the red cheeks, but it was harder to explain why multiple witnesses described what looked like a specific emotional expression. If the face really showed anger rather than a random muscle movement, then something more complicated might have been happening. No one reached a definite answer. No formal experiment followed, but the story became part of medical discussions for decades afterwards. Again and again, researchers returned to the case while trying to understand what, if anything, remained active inside a severed human head. Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier was one of the greatest scientists of his era when he was arrested during the French Revolution. He served as a tax collector under the old monarchy. During the Revolution, that connection mattered more than his scientific achievements. He was accused of financial crimes and treason, convicted, and sentenced to death. On May 8, 1794, at the age of 50, Lavoisier was taken to the Place de la Révolution and guillotined. After his death, a story began circulating that would become one of the most famous guillotine legends. According to the account, Lavoisier arranged a final experiment with a colleague before his execution. Once the blade fell, he would attempt to blink his eyes as many times as possible. His colleague would watch and count. The goal was to gather evidence about how long consciousness might survive after decapitation. The story claims the observer counted somewhere between 11 and 15 blinks before the face finally became motionless. Whether this actually happened is impossible to know. No surviving contemporary document has been found that proves the experiment took place. But the fact that the story remained popular for generations reveals something important. By the late 18th century, the question of consciousness after decapitation was being taken seriously by many educated people. By 1905, the guillotine had been used in France for 113 years. Science had advanced considerably since the French Revolution, and while researchers still lacked modern technology, they now had better methods for observing and recording what they saw. On June 28, 1905, a man named Henri Languille was executed by guillotine at a prison in Orléans, France. He had been convicted of murder. Among those present was Dr. Gabriel Bourriot, a physician who attended specifically because he wanted to observe the severed head immediately after the execution. Bourriot approached the event methodically. He positioned himself close to the guillotine and carefully watched the moment the blade fell. As soon as Languille's head landed, he began timing and observing everything he saw. During the first few seconds, the eyelids fluttered and then closed. The facial muscles relaxed. To anyone watching casually, the head appeared completely lifeless. Then Bourriot called out the prisoner's name. According to Bourriot, the eyelids opened. He later wrote that the eyes appeared to focus directly on him. He didn't describe a random twitch or wandering movement. He claimed the gaze looked deliberate and directed. For several seconds, he believed the head was looking at him before the eyes closed once more. A few moments later, he called the name again. Once again, the eyes opened. Bourriot reported seeing the same focused gaze directed toward him. After that, the response faded. Roughly 25 to 30 seconds after the execution, the head became completely motionless and showed no further signs of activity. Bourriot later published his observations in the Archives d'Anthropologie Criminelle, one of the leading forensic science journals of the time. He was careful about what he claimed. He did not argue that Languille was necessarily suffering or experiencing complex thoughts. He simply stated that the observations were consistent with a brief period of awareness. In his view, meaningful responses may have lasted no more than 5 to 8 seconds within a total period of about 30 seconds. Critics immediately raised the same objection that had existed for more than a century: reflexes. Both sides had reasonable arguments. Bourriot's observations were detailed and carefully recorded. The reflex explanation was also scientifically plausible. The problem was, neither side could prove its case with the technology available in 1905. The debate remained unresolved, and the guillotine continued to operate. To answer this question honestly, we need to understand that the human brain does not shut down like a light switch. The brain makes up only about 2% of the body's weight, yet it uses around 20% of the body's oxygen supply. No other organ demands as much energy. Even when a person is sleeping, the brain is constantly active and consuming oxygen. When blood flow is interrupted for any reason, the brain begins to lose function. But that process is not instant. It happens in stages. Consciousness depends on a continuous supply of oxygen-rich blood. When blood pressure suddenly drops, the brain doesn't simply switch off. It begins to run out of oxygen and nutrients it needs to function. People who have survived cardiac arrest often describe the experience as a rapid fading of awareness, rather than an immediate blackout. Their vision narrows, their thoughts become less clear, and consciousness seems to dim before disappearing. By the middle of the 20th century, studies of combat injuries and severe blood loss had shown that people who lose blood pressure very quickly usually lose consciousness within about 4 to 6 seconds. This became an important reference point when scientists thought about decapitation. Once the neck is severed, blood pressure in the arteries supplying the brain drops almost instantly. Based on what doctors know about blood loss and brain function, consciousness would likely disappear within roughly 5 seconds. But 5 seconds is not the same as 0. And that left one important question unanswered about what happens during those final seconds. In 2011, a group of neuroscientists at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands published a study in the journal PLOS ONE that examined brain activity in rats immediately after decapitation. Before the procedure, the rats were connected to electroencephalogram machines, better known as EEGs. These devices record electrical activity inside the brain. The researchers were especially interested in gamma waves, a type of high-frequency brain activity between 25 and 55 Hz. In both animals and humans, gamma activity is often linked to conscious perception and sensory awareness. It's commonly seen when the brain is awake and actively processing information. The results surprised many researchers. During the first 4 seconds after decapitation, nearly all of the rats showed a large spike in gamma activity. In some cases, the activity was even stronger than what had been recorded while the animals were fully awake before the procedure. The surge reached its highest level during the first 2 or 3 seconds, and then quickly declined. Complete electrical silence generally appeared between 50 and 80 seconds after decapitation. The researchers were careful not to make claims that went beyond the data. Rat brains and human brains share many similarities, but they're not the same. Humans have far larger and more complex brains, and any subjective experience would be impossible to compare directly. The scientists did not claim the rats were definitely conscious after decapitation. Instead, they pointed out that brain activity associated with conscious processing remained present for a short period after death. In 2023, researchers at the University of Michigan published findings that brought scientists closer to the question than ever before. The study involved 4 patients who suffered cardiac arrest while already connected to EEG monitors. They were not part of an experiment. They'd been receiving continuous brain monitoring for other medical conditions. When their hearts stopped, the EEG equipment continued recording brain activity. In 2 of the 4 patients, researchers observed a surge of gamma wave activity at the moment of death. The activity was concentrated in a region called the temporal-parietal occipital junction, an area of the brain involved in perception, visual memory, dreaming, and aspects of conscious awareness. The surge lasted less than a minute and was not seen in every patient. The researchers were very cautious about their conclusions. They stressed that brain activity alone does not prove consciousness. Consciousness requires brain activity, but the presence of electrical signals does not automatically mean someone is having a conscious experience. Even so, the findings were remarkable. At the moment of death, the human brain was not simply going silent. It was producing organized, high-frequency activity in areas associated with awareness and perception. The pattern looked very different from random electrical noise. The study was led by Dr. Jimo Borjigan, who had been investigating the dying brain for years. Back in 2013, she had published similar research involving rats in the journal PNAS. After a decade of studies across different species, the results were pointing in the same direction. The brain does not appear to shut down instantly when death begins. Instead, it produces a final burst of activity. What that burst actually feels like, however, remains unknown. Current technology can measure electrical signals, but it can't tell scientists whether those signals are connected to conscious experience. Whether there was still a conscious person there to experience those final moments is a question that still remains unanswered. It was unanswered in 1792, it was unanswered in 1905, and it remains unanswered today.